All right. I can do this. It's fine. We're just recording a podcast. It's fine.
Literally, our first one came out and the kindness and joy that people responded to it. Like, of course we have to do a second one.
That's true. Like, people were really nice about it. And everyone was like,
so
oh,
nice
I'm so
about
glad
it.
that you're sharing your gifts. And it's like, oh, really? So that's nice. Okay. So let's start. Hello and welcome to Pieces, a podcast where we'll work on outlining the intersection between our personal and political work.
Here we want to create a place to talk about how our relationships with ourselves and our communities are inherently political, integrate the knowledge we have received and continue to receive, and speak to and dream of justice, love, and community.
We are Carson and Ella, two passionate activists exploring community, conflict, and consent as an embodied experience to better understand leftist theory of revolution.
What are we going to be talking about today, Carson?
Nice. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, which is how neoliberalism and like the society basically that we're living in the Western world shapes our personality. And like there's a lot of theory in this, so buckle up. We're gonna kind of try and power through that so we can get to the relationships that we have with ourselves and with others and focus on that. But I think like we can do a little bit of theory. I think a little bit of theory is not a problem.
People are going to love the theory.
People are going to love the theory. The theory is important, and it's important to be able to theoretically underpin a lot of your arguments. So
also, like, I love chewing on a nice theory. It's been 2-3 years since I finished my master's degree, and I'm like, when do I ever just sit around and talk about like different theories? Now, actually, it's
yeah.
So
this is it. It's when we hang out. That's when we do that.
It's how we have fun. Okay.
It really is.
What's the framework of how we're doing this episode this time?
So I wrote one of my theses on this, actually, because that's how much I love this topic. I made a whole thesis chapter on it and spent a lot of time researching it. So I'm going to talk about, basically what I researched, what I came across, what I found, and talk a bit about the theory. And Ella's going to basically do some live responses. It's like, what's that platform for the people who do gaming? Twitch? It's like Twitch.
You're gonna Twitch stream your thesis, and I am chat.
And you're like, exactly. It's like Twitch for neoliberal theory.
I love that you're explaining how a podcast works. Okay, so I will be talking, and then Ella will respond to what I say. And then we're going to record
I love it when you respond. Exactly. Did we want to like spend a moment talking about why we called the podcast Pieces?
Yeah, I thought that would be a cute little intro anecdote.
Why are we called Pieces, Ella?
It was your idea.
It was my idea. The reason I think, like for me at least, why I like the word pieces and like why I like the name Pieces is because we're like piecing together bits of experience, bits of theory, bits of like relationship analysis, kind of like this. I put this between big quotation marks, like psychoanalysis, because, you know, like as I think ContraPoints calls him Herr Father.
Yeah.
We're wary of Herr Father's theories, but like useful also. So it's like we're like piecing together a lot of stuff. And we do that. I think a lot of the piecing together in my life happens in conversation with you, Ella. And so this is just like pieces that we're piecing, right? So
yeah. It also came from the fact that like a piece can be seen as like a composition or like a piece of music or something, you know. It can be its own thing as well as part of a bigger puzzle or a collective. And I also like the idea that we're not experts who have it all figured out, and we're going to like give you a complete picture that you are then going to copy down and it's going to work in your life. Like, I think the fact that we have little nuggets of wisdom and little life experiences and things that just kind of worked well, and we can share those little pieces within this podcast, and then people can use them to make a picture that works for them. I feel like the sun is on your face and you're like a beautiful shining angel of beauty.
Thank you. Ready?
I'm fucking ready. Let's go.
Cool. Let's talk about neoliberalism.
Carson, What is neoliberalism?
Well, neoliberalism is, at least for me, kind of like how I was looking at it and how I was defining it, is basically just this kind of socio-political economic structure that we live in, right? So with my analysis, I was looking at how does it affect not only like economically, right, our ways of organizing, also socially and also politically and also culturally.
So neoliberalism is like, it started off as an economic model. Like it's definitely talking about capitalism. Thatcher came in, Reagan came in, and huge austerity measures were put in place. And it was like the social net of society. Like the government is not allowed to take care of you anymore. It has to be a free market capitalism. So neoliberalism is like an extreme form of capitalism. And as you said,
the neoliberal personality
is like internalized capitalism. Like when you take all of the cultural values of that free market economy and kind of bring it into yourself. So that's how the economic model turns into a cultural model.
So I think like this is basically what I looked at as well, and like this trickle down and this basically like coming from a specific economic structure and it trickling into social institutions, and then from like these social institutions trickling into our personalities. And like an important thing that I think is useful to define here is like, what did it come out of? So it came out of liberalism. And liberalism is kind of like this philosophy of the individual has rights, like the individual consents to the government to be governed. There's like so-called political equality based on the rights of the individual. And these are kind of, it's interesting because I think liberalism through this focus on the individual also obscures a lot of the kind of systematic injustices. And a big thing in liberalism is also like the law and like equality in front of the law and the right to own things. So the right to private property. So here we already see like in liberalism, there's an economic move away from collectively and communally owned things into that person has a piece of paper that says that they own this land and therefore has the right to manipulate it, to sell it, and to do things with it. And so neoliberalism is like the next step from this, which actually says like, okay, the market and like this unrestricted free trade, like this is the logic that will make everyone's life better. So basically like they're advocating for, we just want no government intervention. It's like the market is our government, essentially, right? And we have like perfect competition in between quotation marks, which is like everyone is just fighting for their own thing and trying to compete with everyone else. And the state is not involved. And then like the ideological underpinning to this is like the rational, logical way for us to govern society. This is like the only way that we can get society to work.
Obviously. Sorry, That's not even, I don't question that.
I agree. Like, it's really silly.
It's called hegemony, baby. Look it up.
Exactly. And within this structure, like, we see, like, okay, so, like, what is freedom, right? And freedom is interesting because, like, this concept of, like, freedom as the ability to own things, like, the ability to buy and to own something. And that, I think, like, emerges from liberalism and becomes more concretized in neoliberalism because everything becomes a commodity, right? If you have no more, like, let's say you have no more welfare state, or you have no more kind of like communally owned spaces or communally owned objects, between quotation marks.
The commons, like water and things like that, like those are things that exist in the world and somehow one person owns it.
Exactly.
It's like how the U.S. wants to buy the moon.
Yeah.
Who are you buying
right?
it from?
What does it mean to own the moon, right? What would that look like? Ridiculous. So it's like freedom is kind of seen as like, oh, well, if we have market regulation, then people will be less free because then maybe this product won't be on the market, or like maybe people won't be able to choose between 6,000 phones. And that choice, like that possibility of choice between 6,000 different kinds of phones, which all essentially do the same thing, because if they didn't do the same thing, it would be completely useless to have a phone, right? If like my iPhone and someone else's Android phone were not able to communicate, that would just defeat the purpose of the phone. But like to have like these 6,000 different kinds of phones that do the same thing, that is freedom. right? So this is how we're like kind of conceptualizing freedom.
Yeah. How the hell do you expect people to be able to create phones unless they're competing against other people? Because sharing the technology and having it all be open source, that would be stupid.
Yeah. And there would be no innovation without competition, as if like we didn't have innovation in like our old school communal societies, right? Like as if that's not literally where tools emerged from. Shall we take a look at our history? Anyway, so freedom. Freedom as the ability to own things, and freedom as like the ability for the market to do whatever it wants. And then this kind of like assumes that the market is always going to know how to offer things. So it's like, oh, well, let's privatize our healthcare, because if we don't privatize the healthcare, then like the healthcare market will not be able to respond to the demands and needs of the public. And this is like a fallacy that I think is really strong in a lot of like contemporary discourse around like privatization, which is like, oh, well, if we privatize it, then like because of competition, right, and because like the market responds to demand, it will be more aligned with like the needs of the people. And obviously, like we see that this isn't the case, right? Like it just doesn't work like that. And actually, like a lot of things that I think would be really, really good for the world, which the world is demanding, are being kind of put on the back burner. Well, Elon Musk is shooting rockets up to the moon with our government money.
Yeah, it's like there's been a lot of United Healthcare like news, how they operate, things like that. And they're talking about like, yeah, but the CEOs are always there for efficiency, right? Like they're trying to deny people unnecessary care because they need to be efficient, and that's good. But what was missing was the realization that the definition of efficient that the CEOs are using is how to provide the least amount of care to maximize profits and put all of that money into the pockets of CEOs. And they're like, yeah, but they're being really efficient. And it's like, not in terms of what makes us healthy, not in terms of the priorities of the population that they're trying to serve. All of the definitions keep going back into monetary value and profit.
Exactly. And profit maximization is the goal, right? So when we talk about like the all-knowing market, we're actually talking about like, what does the market do and how does the market respond to maximize profit? And with profit maximization, when we put money and making more money in front of like what people actually need in terms of especially social services and stuff like this, it gets really icky, right? And that's kind of, I think, where we are now. It's just a bit icky.
Can I just I want to interject with, I made a joke earlier about hegemony. Hegemony? How do you pronounce it?
Hegemony? I say hegemony. Hegemony?
Can you tell that we're readers? We are readers. So anyway, hegemony or hegemony is a concept by Gramsci that is the idea that there are some truths in society that are so self-evident and taken for granted that we don't mention them anymore, and we see them as just like a given. And any idea that falls outside of that assumption is so wild that you just kind of reject it. Or it's not even that it's that it's like impossible to think of because it's so taken for granted. And I think that that is something that's going to be underlying a lot of this conversation is, yes, like capitalism and neoliberalism is an economic system, but it informs so much of the parameters of how we see society and what is allowed and not allowed. So the thought of not owning things is so outlandish. We're like, why would we not own things? Of course we own things. That is what freedom is. That is like the basis of society, is that we get to own things. And that's like something that is so taken for granted that the thought of things just being like free and available is just unheard of. I had a friend who recently went to their first like burner gathering, and he was just like, I spent a week where like food was free and just present. And if I was hungry, I could eat. And if I wanted to cook, I could cook, and I would do dishes. And I was just part of this community. And like there was a clothing swap, and that was all free. It was just like anything I needed was available to me. And at first, like the first day or two, I was like, hell yeah, this is awesome. By day 3, I was having a mental breakdown of like, why is this the way that life is like situated? Like, why do I not have access to this into my day-to-day life? And that's what we're kind of talking about here, is like those underlying assumptions of what is possible in a society.
Yeah, no, it's exactly this. The underlying assumptions of like neoliberalism and like the ideology of neoliberalism is we are all free, rational, and entitled, right? Free, rational, and entitled. That makes us wanting to consume, and like that's how we exercise like our freedom. We are able to choose what we want, right? We're agential, like we're free. We're entitled in the sense of we want things and we will take what we want. And we're rational in the sense of, oh, my sock is broken, I will go buy a new sock. This can be rationalized, right? Like that we can break it down into a set of rules and understand it from that set of rules.
My favorite thing is in the study of economics, they have the idea of a rational person and a person behaving in rational ways. And that definition, from my understanding of it, I didn't study economics, is that it's someone who always prioritizes profit and competition and like all of the values of the free market. And so when humans act selflessly, when they try to like prioritize human well-being, it destroys all economic models, and all of them are like, you guys are not acting rationally.
But I think this also ties really well into like what we're talking about, like what the core thing of this podcast is, which we're finally getting to after too much talking, which is like, okay, so we see that all of these economic kind of models are based on a certain kind of person in between quotation marks. And so that brings us very well into, I found 4 different, like what I called disciplinary dimensions, very like gender studies thesis vibes, but basically kind of 4 things that I could identify as, okay, so this is how like this neoliberal theory, like this neoliberal ideology transforms itself into us as people, and how we're taught that like what it means to be a person, right? So subjecthood, what it means to be a person, what it means to exist. These 4 things are like the most important. And these 4 things influence and shape like our experience and our understandings of ourselves embedded within society. And those 4 things are productivity, competition, individualism, and consumption. And of course, like disclaimer, they all interact and they all inform each other. And so of course, like there's going to be some like repetition or some things that are mirrored in each of these kind of like 4 things. But those were kind of like the 4 main things that I identified. And I identified these through like a lot of theory reading, but also like a lot of kind of, you can do like a research method called autoethnography, which is basically like the study of yourself and like how you respond in certain situations. And so like I was doing like a lot of this internal introspection, right? And thinking like, okay, how am I also feeling these things happen to me? Like, how do I see myself reproducing productivity, for example? So let's talk about productivity and about market participation. How do we participate in the market, and how are we like forced to be productive? So one of kind of the main things under neoliberalism, I would say, is like you're rewarded if you're able to make something, right? If you're productive, if you're producing something in service of the market, and you're exiled, or like people want you to change if you're unable to produce. And so here, like I think a really important thing has been for me a lot of like critical disability theory in recognizing this and like recognizing like personhood, even if you're not able to participate. And we see this in our societies all the time. Like ableism is huge, and people who are like not able to produce are basically relegated to the margins of society and not given real personhood. And we also do this to ourselves, right? Like, I know that if I have a really, really bad day and I feel like really unproductive and I feel, oh my God, I'm not doing this, I should be doing this, and my to-do list is so long, I feel like I'm worth less. So we like self-exploit, right? Like we're exploiting our own labor. We're like forcing ourselves through these motions. And not only are we like self-exploiting, we're seeing that self-exploitation. We're seeing like that forcing ourselves to be productive as a necessary and positive part of our identity and our humanness, right? So I am not human unless I have created output by the end of the day. I am worth less care. I'm worth less love. I'm not human. I'm not worthy of like the human rights. I hate human rights in terms of like rights that we have just for existing, not like UN human rights, because I am not producing. So that's like a really like important thing. So we're like enforcing the demands of the market, right? Like this idea of like the market as like inherently productive. We're enforcing that onto ourselves and onto each other. And so kind of like our personality starts to center around like, how much can I do and how much can I produce under like a capitalist logic of production as output of a product, right? So it's not even about like productive work of I sat with my friend and had a really deep, beautiful conversation with them and supported them through a process, or they supported me through a process and we went through a process together. No.
What
you
are
did
you, a
not create a
girl?
product. Yeah, you did not create a product out of that. So no, can't do that. So who does this exclude from definitions
Can I
of
react
our
to some of
humanness?
it? Oh,
Yeah.
that's what I was gonna say.
That's
Actually,
exactly.
I was like, we should. I was like, how is this gendered in so many different ways? Because if we're talking about like, just to go into broad binaries, but like men have like hormonally the 24-hour hormonal cycle of just like, okay, I'm going to wake up in the morning with the most amount of energy, produce all day, and then go to sleep. Whereas people who are menstruating have a very different cycle of productivity, of like energy, of how they can spend that. And I think from a very young age, like when I first started getting my period, I would be throwing up out of the pain. I would have intense cramps. It was like one of those things where I wasn't able to be a person. I remember being in classrooms and like pacing back and forth at the back of the room and then being like, Ella, can you please sit down? We're trying to learn. And me like holding myself and being like, I'm in so much pain, I cannot focus on this. And that wasn't seen as a valid reason to go home and take care of myself. But instead, I needed to learn how to push through that pain and how to still sit in class and take bio notes and force myself to not puke. And I think about that all the time, especially now as I'm getting more familiar with my cycle and how to like work with it instead of against it. It's so interesting. I was about to say to optimize it or to like, you know, like the words that I'm thinking of.
To harness its productive power.
Yeah, when to be most productive. Like, because there's a phase in your cycle where you have all the energy to be productive, and that's the best one. It's like, no, I just need to realize that there are times when I need to lay in bed and do nothing.
This is exactly like, especially for me, like I said, like the main thing was critical disability theory that really led me to like think more about this. And I thought about it in terms of myself. I think like menstruation is a really like getting your period is like, for some people it's debilitating. And like, I'm lucky. Normally I'm okay. But in the last like year, I've had more and more periods where it's like my symptoms start 5 days before my period starts, right? And it's debilitating and I'm sick. My stomach hurts, like everything hurts. Like I'm so tired. And then it's like I can beat myself up about the fact that like, okay, like I can't even do this right now. Like I can't even produce right now. Like I can't work or I'm not doing anything. But basically like this excludes, right? Like this definition of productivity as like a necessary part to our humanness excludes everyone who isn't a machine. And like I think like, for example, houseless people are a really good example here also, because it's just like we don't treat them like people because we look at them on the street and it's like, well, what did you do to end up on the street, right? And also like they're not like a quote unquote functioning part of society. So that gives us the right to ignore them, not look them in the eye, not offer them like basic help, and not treat them like people. And I think like this kind of stuff is super, super important in terms of like conceptualizing how neoliberalism also causes us to treat other people like shit, basically.
And how it relates to like long COVID symptoms, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think this is something we really need to start reckoning with right now, because the chances of you becoming permanently disabled increase by a fuck ton every time you get COVID. And people are starting to get COVID more and more and more. And all of a sudden, you're going to need to rest, and not rest in order to refill the bathtub. And I saw a TikTok metaphor recently that was like, if you're in a bathtub and the water is draining and you need more water, you have to do two things. You have to, one, plug the bottom so that no water goes out, which is one form of rest. And then two is add more water, which is like the rejuvenation process. And I think when people think of rest, they think of plugging the bathtub, like physically sleeping, taking that time off, and not so much the productive rest. What do you call it? Like the rest, rejuvenating rest.
Yeah, like regenerative rest.
Yeah, like hanging out with friends, making art, like doing things that really make life worth living again. And I think with the rise of COVID and long COVID and the effects it's having on the body, you're going to need to just like sit in a dark room and sleep for way longer. And it's not going to be as rejuvenating as you previously experienced it. Yeah. And so once you are no longer able to produce as you could, you know, pre-2019, what is that going to do with your sense of identity and your sense of self and who you are? And can you realize that you are a worthy human being because you exist?
Yeah, not because you're doing something.
My friend, who is a huge disability rights activist, she was staying with me one time. And she was like, yeah, I just handed in this paper or something that she'd been working on for a while. And I was like, oh, amazing. I'm really proud of you. And she was like, why? Because I did something? Can't you just be proud of me for existing? And I remember just being like, why would I be proud of you for just existing? Like, everyone just exists. Like, what the fuck? It was like this huge moment for me.
Yeah.
Where I then sat with it and I was like, oh my God, I still believe that you need to like earn love.
Yeah.
You need to deserve it by doing something that makes someone love you.
Yeah, but that's it, right? Like, and I think like for me, at least like this is manifested as I got a burnout. I got a burnout because I was consistently telling myself, no, you are not doing enough. Like, you have to do more. You have to work more. You have to do this, and you have to go to the gym, and you have to like make yourself into a product also. And like, I hated myself for not doing stuff. Like, I hate it. Like, and I had that last summer when I was kind of in like the middle of the worst burnout, because I think I've had like mini burnouts before this, but like the worst burnout of my life, where I could just do nothing but cry all day. I would stay in bed. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't take a shower. I couldn't cook myself food. I could do nothing. And I was hating myself. I was literally like, Carson, why are you like this? Like, why can't you just get up? Like, just go, just do this thing. Like, it's not that hard. Everyone else is doing it. What makes you so special not to? Right? What is it that makes you so special that you think that you don't have to do all of this stuff that everyone else is always doing? So it's just like this constant like self-disciplining, like self-exploitation of like, oh, I'm tired, but I can't rest because I have to work, because I have things to do. And if I don't do that, I'm not a person. And that's like so sad. Because yeah, like I do deserve to be proud of myself just for existing, just like you deserve love just for existing. Like, you don't have to make anything to deserve love, right? And yeah, I think that's like a really important thing.
I think it's also been like the biggest learning moment of like, my partner is so content with himself and loves to just play games and watch YouTube videos, and is like super happy, you know? It's like, hey, I went off. He works as a tour guide. He was like, I did a 2-hour tour. I walked around, came home. I'm going to sit down and play a game, like just a board game by myself or like a video game. And I watch that and I have so many feelings about what he's doing because I don't allow myself to do that. I've never allowed myself to do that. And it's really confronting to see someone do something that you have not allowed yourself to do. And so many of our fights is I would come barging in and be like, are you watching a YouTube video? We have to take the trash out. We have to like clean the whole kitchen. There is dust on the top of the fridge. And well, I'll like come up with this huge list. And he's like, cool, I'll get to that on a chores day.
Yeah.
When I will do chores. But right now I'm just hanging out. And I literally wouldn't let him do it. And that was a conversation my partner and I had to have of like, I'm going to try my best to just let you rest and let you do the things that you do and trust that when he's looking for a job up here, he's going to apply for stuff. I'm like, you're in charge and I'm not going to tell you what to do because I police you and control you because you're just a huge mirror to me and the patterns that I don't want to recognize within myself, which is not allowing myself to rest and not allowing myself to be complacent with what I did for the day. And a huge thing that has turned my routine around is in my morning routine now, I have decide on most important task of the day. And not tasks, it's one task. And I can have one, maybe two backup tasks, but like one task where if I do that, I'm happy. And that has just like, instead of looking at my entire to-do list and seeing, can I check off as many of these as possible today, choosing one and then being happy with yourself afterwards, I'm like, no one told me this. My mental health is so much better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially in this, the people who are close to us, like reflect so much of that stuff, right? Like it's funny because I think like I recognize the other way around what you're talking about with your partner. Like one of my partners was like a huge workaholic, like huge, still is a little bit of a workaholic. But when we met, literally working like 7 days a week, and I would have to like beg for free time and time off and time that we could just like spend together and chill, like would not stay in bed in the morning, like 7 a.m. We're getting out, we're going to go, and then we're going to work for 12 hours. And I mean, like doing like really important activist work, like all of it was like political work, but still, like, I mean, it's not healthy, right? And we saw this as well, where at some point he just like got to the point where he just crumbled and he was so tired and so like emotionally distressed also from not paying attention to his needs that, yeah, he just like completely fell over. And the amount of like self-hatred that came up during this process, the amount of like tears that came up and guilt and feelings of obligation and feelings of like, oh, but if I don't do this, what am I worth? Like it was heartbreaking to watch, and also just like for me such a strong mirror, and like, oh yeah, like I had been comparing my work ethic, right, with his work ethic and hating myself for not having that work ethic. So we were like kind of working through this process together, and it made me realize like, oh yeah, like I was in, and this is the next point, competition with him, because I felt like I was not producing like he was, and that made me worse than him. And so like that's like the thing about competition, like the second aspect of kind of how I think it manifests in ourselves and in our relationships with others is like if we are nothing than a little producing machine, right? Like a little production conveyor belt, then we also have to compete with other little production conveyor belts. And so this makes us, I think, like really vulnerable to a lot of fracture kind of within our communities and our relationships, because it means that when someone else is like perceptively doing something better than you, especially if it's something that you care about or that you might also want to do, it's really hard to celebrate them. And it's really hard to be like, oh my God, like, I'm so like proud of you and this is amazing. And it's also really hard to celebrate yourself because you're always worried that someone else is going to catch up to you and do it better than you. So it's like, it fractures like our relationships with ourselves in terms of like our ability to be happy and satisfied with who we are and what we're doing, and with others, and our ability to be like happy and satisfied with who they are and what they're doing, right? Because it's like we're constantly like in competition, like it's like a fight, and we can do this with the people that we love the most. Like I've seen it show up in my friendships, right? Like I've seen super deep friendships where there's like low-key competition, and I think like especially when you're socialized as a woman, like there's like this constant competition of like, who is hotter than me? Like, oh, like who is like more desirable in this way? And like, and I see it with me and my siblings, like who is like there's just this like low-key competition that happens all the time. And this makes it really hard to like deeply connect. And that's been like a big thing for me. I think like one of the best ways I think it shows up, like the most funny internet ways it shows up, is like this like I'm not like other girls situation. Oh no, I'm like special. Yeah, exactly. And like stop being a pick me is like even, it's so interesting, right? Because like that's where we see like, okay, so you're condemning like the competition created by someone else, but then that in itself is a reaffirmation that there is competition, right? Because
I'm
like,
better than them because I don't compare.
Because I'm better than them because I'm not a pick me. So it's like I'm better than the person who is saying that they're better than everyone. It's crazy. I'm like, well, maybe we're just all good how we are. Maybe there is no need to compare.
I think all of that is just such a, if you examine the hegemony, like what is it that is not said underneath all of those ways of competing with each other is the scarcity mindset, right? Like capitalism needs us to think of things as limited and that we need to compete for stuff because there isn't enough for everyone to live in abundance. And that's true if we're, hoarding everything to give to a certain 1% of people, then the rest of us can't live in abundance, correct? But it's like, if you look at what is in abundance and what is this like infinite resource, it's love and being proud of each other and like meeting each other where we're at and having those emotional bonds. Like you can have so much love, not to go on a polyamory rant, but you can have so much love. There is no need to like make this be a finite resource that you only share with certain people. And I think a lot of people, when they hear polyamory, just because I mentioned it, they think it's like, oh, you get to fuck whoever you want, la la la. And I'm like, no,
we will do a polyamory podcast and a relationship anarchy podcast.
But like, it's this rewiring of your concept of love and saying, I can have these deep, fulfilling emotional connections with people outside of like the script of that's a friend and you don't do that with friends and you do that with lovers, is like such a stupid thing to put a cap on stuff. Maybe this isn't the right thread of scarcity mindset that I should be going down. But like, okay, let's say it's the scarcity mindset of there are only a certain amount of jobs available, or like who said that there aren't enough jobs for everyone? Why is that a thing that we have just accepted?
Also, I'm like, if there are less jobs, that means that maybe we could all be working 3 days a week instead of working 5 or 6 days a week. Like, the job scarcity, I'm like, how is that a problem? That is a good thing. That means we can work less.
We don't need to be working 80 hours a week.
Yeah, and I think what you said about like this love as a scarcity, like a scarce, right? Or esteem, pride, like people being proud of you is scarce. And I think like that's like where competition gets really strong. And I see this like in my dynamics with my siblings, right? Like I'm super competitive. And why is that? Because I feel that love is scarce and esteem is scarce. And like this is like, obviously I rationally, cognitively know that this is not the case and that my parents absolutely love me and I've received a lot of like unconditionality from them. But the lessons that I learned like as a child, as a teenager around like competition have taught me if I'm not the best, then I won't be loved. Right? That is a capitalist mindset. And then we can like, it's also like a psychological thing of like, oh, like maybe that's because I didn't receive praise. Or like, I don't know, I did receive praise, but we form patterns on the basis of a bunch of different things. But that idea of like, if I'm not the best, then I will not receive love. And I think this shows up, now I want to go into a monogamy rant. I think this shows up in monogamy a little bit as well, because, or in compulsive monogamy. I'm not anti-monogamous. Love monogamy if it works for you, if it's conscious. Excellent. Fuck yeah. Only fuck one person. Only love one person in a romantic way for the rest of your life. Super cool. But like in compulsory monogamy, where we prioritize and hierarchize like our singular romantic relationship above everything else, it's kind of this idea that if your partner then falls in love with someone else, that you've been like knocked off the pedestal of like number one best person for this other person. And that's a competition thing as well. I'm like, well, what if your partner just likes this other person? Like that's also okay, right? But under compulsory monogamy, it says something about your worth, right? About your humanness, about your the worth that you have that causes you to receive love just by existing, right? Or just by like being.
And I think the fact that there's this scarce resource that we're all fighting over, which is like love and men's attention for some reason. That seems to be a big one.
Men's attention is a big one.
Why? Why have I dedicated so much of my life trying to get men to like me, as if that's a finite resource or a scarce resource, which is insane. But it goes into the fact that then, women in particular are seen as competition. They're seen as, only a certain amount of women are going to have higher positions within companies, are going to get promoted. Therefore, for diversity quotas or whatever. Therefore, other women in the workforce are a huge threat to your standing and esteem.
Yeah.
If your man falls in love with someone else, then that is also seen as like you need, you know,
You didn't
the
do
fact
good
that you
enough.
found a good man and you got his attention is like amazing, and now you lost it and now you're a failure. And all of this goes over to the distrust that we have for other people.
Yeah.
And it leads to that fragmentation and that fracturing within society, because if we all just loved each other and had a great time, then we would be too powerful. Like we would just be a huge group of people who all work together and was like, oh, do you not have like some parts of you that you don't like? That's cool. You're still welcome and loved here. That, I think it's something that like my mom and I talk about a lot, because they used to have that a lot more than we do now. But I think that there has been social media, the different algorithms, the echo chambers, the, you know, trying to get each other to be in this like outrage economy, to constantly be mad at each other, and it fractures us and causes us to infight instead of looking up to see how we can solve this.
Yeah, but that's also competition, right? Because it's like, no, my truth is more right than your truth.
Thank you. That was the point I was trying to make, but
like,
I lost it.
It's just like, okay, cool. No worries. Love you. Glad we think the same.
Glad we think the same.
But yeah, like I think like this is exactly what I mean. Like it causes, like competition causes us to have such precarious relationships with each other, but also like with ourselves. Like it's so sad. It's actually so sad. And
I used to be so skinny at this year. Why am I not at that weight anymore? Why have I changed? Why? I am going to set myself some New Year's resolutions so that I can be stronger a year from now than I am now. Yeah. So I need to compete with past Ella.
Yeah. Exactly. With past Ella and with with other people who kind of look like you, right? Like it's, anyway. Not only are we always in competition, now we go into individualism, we are always like fully responsible for like, because of this, we're fully responsible for our own success, right? So like individualism here, I am talking about individualism as manifesting as like, you are completely responsible for yourself, only yourself. All of the outcomes of your life are your responsibility, and all of the things that you do in your life are entirely for you. Right? So bad luck doesn't exist. It's your fault. There's no one to blame but you. That's it. It's all on you. And like that, we're already talking, right? We're talking about productivity. We're talking about competition and like the way that that makes us punish ourselves. This ideology that it's always our responsibility, that it's like me, the individual, everything is my fault. Everything is my problem. I have to solve it all by myself. We're just like punishing ourselves more and more for failing to comply with like the standards that are set against us, even though those standards are completely unrealistic. Like, I'm not a machine. And this is like also furthering this idea that I'm alone in my struggle, right? And that I have like, oh, I'm the only one who's experiencing this. And like, that was like, when I started working with critical theory, I remember like a lot of it was around gender and a lot of it was around like beauty standards. And I was like, holy shit, other people have thought about this. Like other people have done the same kind of thinking. Other people have had a similar experience. And so like the more individualist we become, like the more focused on ourselves as like the only responsible and like the only like important thing for which we act, like the more we strip ourselves of like the possibility of finding other people. And like I think like shame is a big part of this, right? Because like we're shamed when we're not productive. We shame ourselves when we're not productive. We're shamed if we're not like winning a competition. We shame ourselves if we're not winning a competition. It's like this like nonstop flow of shame. And I think like individualism causes us to like not ask other people for help, like not reach out and not like try to connect on shared experiences. It creates fragile communities where we're consistently like concerned about looking out for ourselves and like, oh, this person harmed me and therefore like I have to do something to like to stop this because like me, the individual, and like I have to take care of myself. I think it creates poor interpersonal skills. Like I just don't think like it gives us like honestly, like I don't think it gives us like a lot of empathy, because if you don't have empathy towards yourself, how are you going to have empathy towards another human being? And we're not like good at doing conflict resolution and things like this. And I like you just mentioned social media, and I think just social media is like such an important part of this, and this will come back also in kind of like the consumption, which is like the next point. But like social media, like we talked about this, it went from like Facebook groups. So like these groups where you were like in with a lot of people and you were like, oh, like we're all sharing this thing and like we're in community, to like Instagram, where it's like, this is my personal brand. Look at me. I am the only person who matters in the world. And this is my opinion and my face. And here you go. And that's kind of like the standard now of how we present ourselves, right? Like as individuals.
This is
Or as,
my
like, individual
profile. Follow me. I have to be the center of it. I think this is why I'm having such a hard time promoting myself and like trying to get the work out that we're doing, is I don't want to be the center of it. I want the work to speak for itself. And I think that there are a lot of people that are doing the work that we are doing.
Yeah.
And I don't want to market myself as better than them, or like, I think it's true that we're different than other people that are doing this work. And there is a reason that people might want to hear our takes and our experiences, but having to have like one individual stupid Instagram account where I'm like, follow me and hear what I have to say makes me deeply uncomfortable, because it's so antithetical to the work I'm doing, which is like, it's not about me as an individual.
Yeah, 100%. And like, so I think like this one and consumption kind of go hand in hand. So I'm going to like move into...
I remember what the other part was that I wanted to say.
Tell me.
We'll get into this next time on when we're talking more deeply on white supremacy culture. But a big thing that they highlighted there is when you're an individual, you also think that everything is your responsibility to solve. And I think that that has been like shoved down our throats from such a young age of, I remember all of my school projects being like climate change and we are all going to die soon because of like the CO2 emissions, and it's on your shoulders to fix it. And you need to recycle. You have to turn the water off while you're brushing your teeth. That was a huge thing for my childhood. I don't know why. It was like, turn the water off while you're brushing your teeth. And like all of these things, it was like, if you don't do it, then the whole world is going to end. And it's not like, hey, let's all band together. But like, you need to do it. You need to shame other people who aren't doing it.
Yeah.
And God forbid you look at all of the corporations and governments that are bombing people and destroying the environment in that way. That's not important. What's important is that you do your part. And I think that crippling sense of like, it's all on your shoulders, and if you don't do it, it's all going to fail, is also what leads to this burnout and this competition and this like stress response that we're constantly in. If we could share the burden amongst other people, maybe it wouldn't be so scary.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think like not only that, it's just like it erases completely like the systematic factors like racism, like sexism, like homophobia and transphobia. Like those are all things that are actually not your fault. I mean, actually just not your fault if you're Black. It's actually just not your fault if everyone sees you as a woman and therefore is surprised that you're also smart, right? That's actually not your fault. Like, it's fine. You don't, and it's not your responsibility to like by yourself go and solve that. And it's also like not every single person's like individual responsibility to like, I have to solve this, me, the individual. And I think like this actually links, there's so much interesting stuff I want to say about this actually. There's too much. Let me gather myself. No, I was kind of like this individualist idea of like the revolutionary and like the activist, and how we see this show up in our movements of like, oh, me, the individual, like I'm going to solve the problem. And that we kind of get this grandiose idea of ourselves as like these revolutionaries, right? Like, oh, it's like me on the barricade with my flag and like I'm solving the problem. Like I'm not reproducing these structures. And it like stops us from having patience with other people, but it also stops us from like actually being able to thoroughly examine the ways that we are reproducing these power structures. And like it's a very individualist and kind of like branded way to look at like what activism is.
But it's also like it's impossible to solve all of society's issues by you yourself doing something. Like, yeah, it's a great idea to live life this way, be the role model. Like, people don't learn by being told what to do. People learn by seeing it and like mimicking each other. So it's also really important to do it. But I think it's so funny that everyone sees themselves as like an individual. They try to do something on their own. It doesn't magically save all of society. And then you get mad at everyone else. It doesn't lead anywhere. We all have to work together.
All right. Consumption last tenets.
Consumption.
So you've had productivity, 1. We've had competition, 2. We've had individualism, 3. And now comes consumption. And so I would say neoliberalism is basically like a promoter of continuous consumption. And the way that we see this show up is really deeply related to individualism, but it is in the cultivation of a personal brand. Our identities, though I think like there's so interesting because there's been like a shift in this also, like where we recognized marginalized identity as something like relevant and important, and it becomes more and more relevant and important in terms of like cultural expression, right? And for most marginalized identities, I think like those have consistently been relevant and important. But we recognize under neoliberalism, like a neoliberal identity is created and expressed by buying things and by showing other people the things that you have bought, right? So our communities become like bought and not acquired, as in like, oh, I relate to this subculture, so I'm going to purchase like the clothing, the music. For example, like it's crazy, right? And I do this as well because like for me, it's like, and there's like a tension because like on the one hand, it's like, yes, like I purchased this to show, like to represent my affinity towards a cause and towards a community and towards like a group of people who are fighting for a certain thing. And I'm purchasing something, right? Like I'm buying something to represent myself in the social sphere. So we are like showing our identities through this symbolism. And I see this in queer culture as well, right? Like it becomes more and more capitalized and more liberal, where it's like, I am like this queer person and you can see that I'm queer because I have ABC markers of queer identity. And yeah, like, so there it just becomes like kind of like this ostentatious display instead of like a community that's like really emerging through like a collective thinking and like a common understanding of like, how do you see the world? How do you experience the world? Like, how am I experiencing gender, for example? And this is like a dangerous thing. And I think like the nice thing about this is that there have been like really good critiques, and there is like quite a lot of good critique around consumption culture, for example, like from queer folk, but it's still happening. And I do think it's like a important thing to say. And I think like social media and celebrity culture, like where it's like, oh, you know, you have like a Kylie Jenner who is a very strong personal brand, who very much like puts herself forward as like, I am XYZ, and you can see that from my markers of XYZ. And if you want to be like me, then you can buy this thing that I have created so that you can be a part of this.
The Kylie Jenner lip pit.
The lip pit.
The Kylie Jenner lip kit.
The Kylie Jenner lip kit.
Right?
But yeah, like,
to have the lips like Kylie Jenner. Like you can buy her lips to look like her.
Yeah, and like this is crazy, right? Like I'm like, why would you want to do that if you could just have your own lips? But like, then that relates to beauty standards and like, how much do we appreciate ourselves like just for existing, and like, how does pretty privilege function? But that's for another day.
Our favorite catchphrase on this podcast.
Yeah, literally. It's a good job that we started a podcast because we have a lot of shit to talk about. But yeah, so like I think like social media and like the cultivation of like a personal platform and a personal brand and like selling brands products as a part of your personal brand, like the entire influencer culture, like that is like for me peak like individualism and peak consumption culture, because it's like, oh, look at this person, they are like better than everyone else. Competition we see showing up there too. They're like living their best life. How is it that they're living their best life? They're buying these products. And if you want to live your best life and be a part of this community, you could also buy this product, right? And then if you buy this product, you will also be like this person. That is an insane thing to think. Like, it is an insane thing to think that you're going to have a life like this influencer if you buy like their fucking face cream, right?
But I think that this is something that I noticed with all of the 4 things that you were talking about, the 4 elements, dimensions, is like how there is also a kind of person who does the exact opposite of that as a statement, but it's still kind of perpetuating the same thing. So for instance, I am anti-consumerist, and therefore I do not like it if I am seen with something with a logo on it. I don't like it if there's like branding on my clothes. That makes me very uncomfortable. Some of my clothes have like holes or patches on them, or there's like a DIY element of upcycling. That will also show to other people that I don't like consumerism. You can see me frequent secondhand stores. You can see me thrifting. Like the fact that I wear thrifted clothes and they look thrifted is also the appeal, because I want people to know this about me.
So you can see how I'm still using the hegemonic worldview of you need to showcase your belonging to a certain group or your ability to be part of a community by what you're buying. And I feel like this is what Audre Lorde was saying of you cannot use the master's tools to break down the master's house. So like I am trying to showcase that I do not believe in consumerism by using the consumerist logic of buying things to showcase who I am on the inside, like what my identity is, what I believe in.
And I have that with so many different markers of identity, but it's because we need to cultivate a look or an aesthetic. I caught myself recently saying, oh, of course that person's non-binary. I can see it. I can tell that they are showcasing themselves as non-binary.
Yeah.
That is not where we wanted to go with this.
But I think like that's a good way, I guess, like that we can kind of finish like the last kind of part of this podcast is like these things show up in all of us, right? Like I have every single one of these things, like all four of these things I came to because I was examining like how do I feel these institutions of neoliberalism show up in myself. And it really fucks me up, right? And it fucks up my relationships. And it's been like a lot of unlearning. And like, I think we do this all the time. And that was also an argument that I made in my thesis, was that like the perfect neoliberal subject doesn't exist and actually can never be achieved. So we're all in this perpetual state of daddy doesn't love me because I'm not good enough. So I have to try harder. And that's like a really good way to keep us going through the motions and continuing to participate in all of these structures that like don't work for us. There's like a really beautiful thing that you said earlier when we were on the phone talking about one of my relationships, where you said the goal is not to completely stop doing it. The goal is to try to move it a little bit more each time. And I think like that's the same here, right? Like it's like, oh my God, I'm again doing this competition thing, or I'm again being like super individualist, or I'm again being super consumerist. It's like fine. But like it's like not fine, but it's fine. Or like, I mean, and the best that we can do and kind of like the most that we can do to counter this is, at least for me, right? Like, and this is like the only way that I've found to not fall into this trap of like competition, of like trying to be perfect, of trying to be super productive, of me taking full responsibility for everything, is to say, okay, you know what? Sometimes I'm going to want to do things that match with hegemonic systems. And that doesn't mean that it's inherently bad. That doesn't make me inherently bad. That doesn't mean that I believe in or want to perpetuate any of these things. But like we grew up in this society, right? Like we live in a society. But I think like that's a really important and big thing to remember, is it's just like we are the embodiment of all of these things because we grew up in Western society. And like what's important is to try and cultivate our communal personality. So it's like, how do I start to relate to others in a different way? How do I start to relate to myself in a different way? How can I start to kind of like recognize these things? Like, oh, that's interesting. I'm doing this competition thing again. Because that's what I started to do, like, especially in like, for example, like in the dynamic with my siblings. It's like, oh, someone else is getting praise. Oh, that's interesting that's bothering me. And I don't have to do anything else with it because it's just noticing it, right? It's just noticing it. And then hopefully like the people that we create and raise in whatever way, shape, or form will be able to kind of come at it from an even better perspective, like an even more developed perspective. And that's for me, like a lot of this work is like just a recognition and then like an active, like also sometimes just like trying to do the opposite. It's like, I mean, you do the money thing, which I think is really good. And I think you should talk about that.
The money thing?
Where you have your budget for the day.
Ismatu.
Yeah. So like, but what you're about to explain for me is a really big kind of like do the opposite, or like create an active practice where you challenge these structures. So what is it that you do?
Can we get through a podcast without referencing Ismatu? Will be a fun game we can play, but not today because
because we cannot.
Because we cannot. We love them. Ismatu.Gwendolyn, the Reddings, we can link them in the show notes as well, I'm sure. Yes. They had this idea of like, how often are you scrolling through social media and you see a GoFundMe, some kind of fundraiser, something? And what Ismatu suggested is giving yourself a daily budget of how much money you're willing to spend. And that is how much time you get on the internet for the day. Hey! And like using their method now, as I'm scrolling through, if I see any fundraiser at all, I give them the minimum amount that I can donate. So for some websites, it's $1. For some, it's $5. It depends. But I give them the minimum amount, and it's indiscriminately. If anyone is asking for money, they get it. And I just do that until my budget has been used up for the day. And then I put my phone away and I stop scrolling, because if I run into another GoFundMe, then I'm going to have to pay them because I don't want to say like, you're done.
Yeah.
So it's been really good for my phone habits. I'm not scrolling through social media forever. There's a certain point where I just cap it. It's doing a lot for my sense of engagement with the world, because I feel like I can give, and to all of the GoFundMes that I see. So I feel like there's this abundance. I'm giving. I feel connected. It's lovely. And I don't feel like I have to make those choices of who deserves my money and who doesn't. Mm-hmm. And it really just takes me down a peg in importance, which is always a beautiful practice that I enjoy partaking in. And I just feel, like I'm helping, like I'm doing something. And now when I'm done, I get to like crochet little frogs and do other stuff with my time that isn't scrolling through social media. And just seeing so many pleas for help that you're just scrolling past because
because you can't.
At some point you can't anymore. Yeah. Like if everyone says, please stop scrolling, like my family's dying if you keep scrolling. And they're like, don't just like it, but like comment, use my audio. Like it becomes so overwhelming. And it it feels really selfish to say how upsetting it is for your mental health to see it. But like you have to engage with it. And I think this is something my brother and I had a really long conversation about, of like, you can't just keep numbing yourself to this and hoping that it'll go away, because it's going to be all over your Instagram or TikTok feed. Like you're going to see it. And if you just keep not helping, not doing anything and shutting it off, you're going to hurt yourself, like emotionally. And so finding a way that you can limit your field into what it is that you have control over and how you can actually help and make a difference is going to do wonders for your sense of like contributing to society.
Yeah. And I mean, with that also, like, remember, if you're feeling selfish and like guilty, because like I have the productivity problem mostly in relation to social justice stuff and like activism stuff. And one thing that I try to remember is like, I was not made to see this amount of violence. We were not made to see this amount of violence. So it's like really important that we stop looking at the violence sometimes, not because we want to pretend that it's not there, but because we understand that like we are not made for this. Like no one is made to live in this world where there's so much violence. And so like to do something about it within like a framework, I think is really, really helpful. And I really like this tool. And I do a similar thing with houseless people. So it's just like I indiscriminately give money to people on the street. And I have gotten comments about it, right? Like I literally have had friends be like, oh, well, you shouldn't give that to them because then they just do this with it. And I'm like, yeah, but the thing is like, I understand why they would just buy drugs or why they would buy alcohol. And I actually have no problem with that because like they are living on the street and that is fucking horrible. And I would probably also drink or do drugs if I was living on the street in that situation. So yeah, like to really like re-grant agency and humanity to people who are marginalized and like kicked out of society. Like I think like those are ways where we start to challenge this in ourselves and to recognize like these thought patterns and to be like, hey, you know, is that true? Is that true? Is that something that someone told me once? Or is that really true? Like, is this person really like less deserving? Or is that something that I understand because they're not functioning in a way that like makes sense to me in the framework that I know. So,
and I think especially the competition one of like, are you feeling superior to someone in some way, and why? Just not that it's wrong, again, like with all this stuff, just like think about it. Like, okay, in what parts of yourself do you feel superior to others, and how is that motivating you? Yeah. Something I noticed is I see myself as a more clean person, or a like more put together, tidy person than a lot of the people I've been living with for the last couple of years. And a lot of my cleaning was coming out of a sense of moral superiority and like a feeling of spite. And it was the only thing that was motivating me, is I knew that they were all really messy. I wanted to prove that I was not as bad as they were.
Yeah.
And so seeing how messy their rooms, plural, would be the incentive I needed to go and like clean all the dishes out of my room and be like, look how amazing I am. And as soon as there was someone who I thought was like cleaner than I was, I would just stop cleaning. I would be like, what's the point? I'm not the best anymore. And it would like lose all motivation. And so it's like the sense of competition that just either drives me or completely shuts me down.
Yeah.
And it's unhealthy. I just want to be able to have a stable sense of self, no matter what the other people around me are doing.
Yeah.
That would be nice.
Yeah. And also just because it just makes like your relationship so much nicer, right?
Yeah.
It's just nicer to not be in competition. Oh my God, there's so many things that we could talk about competition. We really we'll devote like a podcast to competition, I think, because now I'm also thinking about like when you're fighting with someone close to you and the competition to be right. And like the competition of whose reality is better than whose reality. So like there's a lot of competition here that we could talk about, but that's for another time.
I think what I liked about this was it was a cool theoretical overview of stuff. And it shows how we can endlessly talk about all these different dimensions. I'm down to publish this. I think this is going to be a cool podcast in terms of like, here's some theoretical background, and here's like kind of the more academic side of what we're talking about. But I can't wait to tie it into more of the personal and anecdotes and stories in future.
I think we probably could have better titled this like the beginning of exploring the neoliberal personality, because I think you're completely right. And I also think that there's just too many things to talk about. There's too much stuff to talk about here. So this is like an introduction into all of these things that we think. And we'll continue it at a later date.
Thanks for listening to Pieces.
You can find us on Patreon through the show notes, where we'd love to hear what stuff resonated with you, where your questions were, stuff that you want us to expand on.
We'll also add links to our email address if you want to get back to us, or Ismatu's work and other ways of contacting us.
Yeah. We hope this had some moments of learning for you, and we hope you tune in for our next conversation.
Next time on Pieces, we'll be talking about white supremacy culture.
See you then.
See you then.